Sounds good. So first of all, thank you all for joining this. Time is your most precious resource. So I really appreciate all of you joining for this kind of conversation about women leadership, especially during Women's History Month here in March of 2021. So I'd love to just kind of do around kind of the Zoom board and just kind of do a name, the organization you represent. And then my question is, what place do you want to travel first when hopefully the pandemic has ended? So I'll start out just going in alphabetical order. So Courtney, Aber, could you please start?
Sure. I'm Courtney, Aber. I'm with YMCA Bold and Gold, and I have so many places that I want to go. There's the levels of like escapism of the day, but I've been thinking a lot about Morocco.
Morocco. All right. Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lise Aangeenbrug with the Outdoor Industry Association. My pronouns are she and hers, her. And where do I want to travel? Unfortunately, I really want to go see my sister. She was just diagnosed with cancer, and I can't go see her until I have a vaccine. And I'm really excited to go see her.
Where is she?
Outside New York City.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, we're sending you and your family positive energy, Lisa. Sarah.
Hi, Sarah Milligan-Toffler. My pronouns are she, her, and President and CEO of the Children in Nature Network. And the first place I will be traveling is Sydney, Ohio, to visit my mom, who I haven't seen since her 90th birthday last March 8th.
Nice. Well, hopefully all of you are going to get to those places. Morocco, visiting family are obviously key things. And I hear you, Courtney, that it changes by the day, but it's good to see that we are turning the corner in this pandemic. Just want to start out with kind of a personal baseline question. You know, as young women growing up, were there any kind of, what were your kind of professional or just personal kind of aspirations? So putting yourselves back into, let's put you in my daughter's age. When you were age 11, what were you kind of aspiring as young women to be?
Yeah, I have a vivid memory at that age of writing a paper about how I wanted to be a marine scientist, because I had this vision that I could dry up the ocean and walk along the seafloor and be able to see things that I couldn't. I loved the ocean, and you couldn't see anything. I'd never been snorkeling. I'd never been scuba diving. I was like, how am I going to see what's at the bottom of the ocean? So I had these crazy ideas, and I wrote a paper about it.
Nice. Sarah, Courtney?
I'll just jump in and say, Martin, I really didn't have big career ambitions. I set my sights pretty small, actually, as a kid. And I grew up in a small town where, most people didn't even go on to college. And so I was thinking I wouldn't go to college. I wasn't a very good student. And, fortunately, I had parents that were kind of like, silly girl, you're going to college. Like, that's just where, like, you have to pick one. So I must have toured them. I don't even remember touring colleges. And I ended up at a state school in Ohio and kind of had an awakening there that, sort of turned the course of my, kind of my whole life. But yeah, I mean, growing up, I will just say, like, not a lot of great role models for me.
And even outside of career, Sarah, I'm just curious, like, what did you think about when you thought about that future? Like, did the future excite you at all? Or was it something that, as a young woman, it was hard to think of kind of a bright future, whether it was career or just like personal things that you kind of hope to do?
That's a good question. I mean, it wasn't that I wasn't excited about the future. I just didn't have any specific like ideas about, like, I was pretty sheltered, really, like living in a small town. I was pretty sheltered. There were hardly any Black people there. I remember my first friend that I made in college was a woman named Kathy Birkenstein. And like, after knowing her for like 2 months, like, are you Jewish? And she's like, Kathy Birkenstein from Winnetka? Yes, like where did you grow up? And like I really didn't know that like there were Jewish people alive in the world. I thought they were in biblical times.
Hmm.
I mean, I was very sheltered in that sense, culturally. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Courtney.
Similar, differently, but I also didn't really have any things I thought of that I was going to be when I grew up. I think for better or for worse, I've always been a person who's been pretty centered in like where I am at the moment. And so that sometimes that's been really awesome in my life. And sometimes that has been, means that I don't think about that kind of what I'm going to do in 10 years. And so I do actually think that being a woman or a girl was a part of that, and what I got asked to do, and questions that were asked of me. And that's also kind of my nature as well. When I was in high school, I was like, well, I guess I'm going to go to art school because I really like art. But it literally wasn't until my senior year that I started thinking about like, well, what are the careers that come out of this? And I was like, oh, no, I don't want to do any of those things. But I knew it was the right thing for me to do at the time. And it's actually been super helpful. I feel like I got a degree in creative thinking, which has been awesome. But it definitely wasn't a laid out career plan.
Interesting. And because it's Women's History Month, did you guys, the three of you, I'm just curious, did you have role
Can I
models?
just point out that you called us guys?
I know.
Okay.
First faux pas of tax.
All right. I just had to say it in this call.
I know. It's worth
Well, I'm
pointing out.
trying to eradicate that from my vocabulary too, Martin.
Oh, it's
really
super hard.
Well, plus I'd say I know we're not all the same age, but we're of that age where guys wasn't.
Oh,
somebody called you, you didn't bat an eyelash. You didn't think
totally
that was any kind of offensive thing. And now when you think about it, it is kind of offensive, but
it is though. I mean, you think
I was
about
called
it.
much worse things. So
yes. Well, we can all get points for how much Martin says on some of the faux pas. But I'm curious of some of your role models and heroes, who they were, and if they were female or male, like non-gender specific. I'm just curious on some of who your role models were as you guys, as you all grew up. My second faux pas, as you grew up.
I can go first on that. I didn't have any, because I didn't feel like there were people who I resonated with. I was like, oh, I want to be like that person. I would say it was in my 20s when I sort of found my first female role model that I would have defined that way. I don't think it's that I didn't have any previously, but I would have never named it that way earlier. And again, I think it's, partly because of the questions that people asked of me, or ways that I was taught to even think about myself or what I should aspire to.
Lisa, Sarah, I'm curious from both of your ends on that.
Kind of similar to Courtney, actually. So go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, what's interesting for me now, I go back and think about it, I don't think I thought of them as role models, but my experience was at home, anything was possible, and it was at school. I grew up in Kansas. It's when I got into school where it was more questioned. At home, my dad was giving us National Geographics, and the world was our oyster. I mean, we weren't going anywhere, but we had National Geographics. And so I thought Jane Goodall was amazing, and Jacques Cousteau, and maybe it was because the only exciting thing in my life were these National Geographic magazines, but I never thought of them as role models. But now I look back on it now, and they definitely were.
Interesting. So in doing some research for this, I saw that women make up a majority of nonprofit employees, yet they're a minority of nonprofit CEOs. And it was interesting because there's actually statistics that show that the gap increases as an organization budget increases. So the top level, nonprofit CEOs are mostly men. And I'm just curious, from your positions as CEOs of these organizations, what do you think are some of the factors that contribute to that disparity?
Because we define male qualities as leadership qualities in this society. And when women display those qualities, they're too blunt, right?
I think it's the triple B word, where if you're blunt, you're considered a bossy, or another B word.
Mm-hmm. There was a really fascinating piece done, about kind of people's perception of women leaders when Hillary Clinton was running. And it was the on the Hidden Brain podcast, if you ever listened to that. And they, the social science around it, and this is men and women alike, like certain characteristics are associated with men, and they tend to be those leadership qualities. And so there's a cognitive dissonance that we have when women display leadership. Like, it doesn't, like if women act too female, then that's not leadership, and that doesn't work. And if you act too male, then that doesn't float well either. So you kind of have to find this right balance all the time.
I agree with you, Sarah, but I also see something now that I think we're all, again, of a certain age, that we weren't groomed to be leaders. We weren't seen as leaders. And that's changing. Like, I look at the younger women on my staff, it wouldn't occur to them to not think they were going to be the executive director someday and to have that aspiration. But when I think back when I was 24, that was such an anomaly. Mm-hmm. And not something, no man ever came, and it was all male leadership. I was frequently the only woman in the room, the only young woman in the room. Mm-hmm. No male ever came and said, can I mentor you and help you become a leader? And I think that's really different now.
I think you're right, Lisa. Good point.
I also think that there's, Sarah was talking a little bit about this. There's so much bias, not just about women as leaders, but as women in just as people. And so there's, the more people you have involved in a decision, the harder it is to choose the woman. And as an organization grows in size, there are typically more people involved in making a decision about who they're going to hire. And there's just that many more biases that you need to overcome. And I think that those biases aren't just about leadership, but there's an interesting article on some research about assumptions around brilliance or genius, I think was the term that they used. People are very, very strongly biased towards men as geniuses. And that's a term that is almost never applied to a woman, regardless of the field or the position. And so if you're looking at that overall and your overall view of somebody's competence, intelligence, strength as a person, and then you layer on top of that your assumptions about leadership, it's pretty hard to overcome that.
So I do wonder, Lisa, based on what you were saying, if, as more women serve in leadership roles, mm-hmm. if, we all just become more comfortable with that. And so that kind of that bias will shift over time as more women just occupy those leadership spaces.
I think it may, because the other trend that I've noticed, I was just on this women's outdoor summit last week with a lot of younger women who had far more chutzpah than I had at their age. And I think the other difference is they envision themselves as leaders. And if they don't get it, they leave and they'll go start their own thing, which was not even an option at that age for us. And I think that's amazing. So it's creating a competitiveness in the marketplace in some ways that wouldn't have existed, and kudos to them.
Mhm.
So following up on kind of, that, I'm also, very interested that women also, in doing some of my research, hold fewer board positions, which, right, are like the power, either at an association like you run, Lisa, or nonprofits, Courtney and Sarah, like you run. So
Mhm.
what do you think needs to be done overall to improve that representation and put more women in leadership positions or just on boards in general?
Mhm. I think it's
Yeah, go ahead,
Oh.
Courtney. Go ahead.
I think it's naming it in a lot of ways. Once people are aware of that dynamic, then I think it shifts. There's been some pretty fascinating research that's come out in the past couple of years about profitability in women on boards. And I think that was a big driver of increasing representation on for-profit boards. And I think that it is reminding people of the power of diversity in thinking. And I think that one of the things that is happening right now with a focus on racial equity is that we're not always looking at intersectionality. And there's women are, half the population, and not not marginalized, and not having to overcome the same kind of barriers that people of other dimensions of diversity are. And at the same time, that is still a pretty fundamental aspect of the way people approach things and think about things. And so, just remembering that there are a lot of different ways, not only women, like definitely not saying that, but that's also an aspect of thinking about who we want to be a part of decision making.
Sarah, Lisa?
Go ahead, Lisa, you were going to go.
It's intentionality. I think once you see it and you recognize and you start to change it, it happens. And I think, it's taken, it's probably taken 20 years in my mind, at least in the conservation outdoor recreation space, for women to start to occupy almost 50% of board seats. But it was an intentional decision, and they didn't get it right at first. I remember being asked to be on a board at 50, and I was the young woman. So I guess what my point is, it's this intentionality. It's sort of recognizing it and then going out and trying to not just check boxes and fill seats, but think about what women bring to the table that might be different.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that Courtney and Lisa said. I think the challenge, and I think boards oftentimes, particularly in the nonprofit sector, are really, you're hoping that those folks are going to be helping to raise money, right, to the sustainability of the organization. And so all of the other things that we've been talking about men holding, top positions in the corporate sector and the foundation sector, that kind of ties to why more men have historically been on those boards. But I mean, I think, we're seeing lots of creative, women have, maybe if they, first of all, women hold more wealth than we sometimes recognize. And then, often it's those social networks that they have that can help access, the resources or, the partners that you need to, to fulfill an organization's mission. So, but I just think, there's a lot of stuff that's going to take some time to work through our society, right? And I think it's happening. So that's the hopeful piece.
So we brought up kind of again that lack of women in leadership positions and CEOs, lack of boards. I was shocked, or not shocked, but I was, it's amazing to see the disparity when you then look at how women of color are in leadership roles and on the board and in nonprofits. And I know, as three women who are CEOs of organizations that are really committed to being on the front lines of equity and racial justice, I'm very curious to hear from your perspective on what do we need to do to increase that diversity at all levels of senior leadership, especially in empowering women of color into those roles.
We have to use our place of privilege to do it. Really, I think so. Expand our networks, invite people in, give over power, mentor.
Courtney, Lisa, any thoughts on that?
And I also think we need to really deeply examine what we consider as qualifications, because there's so many things that often become code for, I want to hire a white person. And they're not actually integral to the success of somebody in a role. Or we judge people on cultural norms, especially as you get into more senior leadership positions. There's this aspect that you need to fit in and behave in a certain way, that again is code for being white or being really privileged. Coming from a wealthy background can be another way that you could show up in that space, but it's not at all examining what are truly the skills to have somebody be successful. And especially if we want to think about innovation and being relevant or changing the way that we do things. And one of the things that I think we hear a lot about is the benefits of diversity of perspective. But again, if we're checking a box and we're not really interested in shifting the way that we do things or operate, then we want to stay in and protect the ways that we do things. And that often comes with picking people who are seen as like. And I think we need to simultaneously be interested in change and looking at who we have fill those roles.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And coming now, stepping in a few years ago to an industry that I was not intimately familiar with and now am, which was very male dominated, very white. It's changing. And when I think about this, and it's sort of how I see the connection between what I do and what Sarah does and what you do, Courtney, is it's a system that's created this. And if we think just putting somebody on the board is going to change the whole ecosystem of either the outdoor industry or the outdoor education network or the youth network, it's got to be engaging kids. It's got to be mentorships. It's got to be internships. It's got to be changing how local government gives people places at the table to create outdoor spaces. It's inclusivity in the workplace. It's inclusivity on the board. When you bring in what, I don't think this is happening as much, but a lot of times what would happen is somebody would be brought onto a board as the only person of color or the only woman person of color or the only woman. And then the expectation was, you're going to tell us what we have to do to become more inclusive or whatever. And that's a lot to ask of somebody.
And then we're board.
And I don't speak for all, I don't speak for all women. And I certainly don't speak for women of color. So it's just sort of changing. It can't just be about putting the person on the board. It's important. The board is an outward expression of the values of an organization. So it is super important, but it's got to be bookended by all of these other things.
Great.
I'd add just real quickly to that, Lisa, that, what our board has talked about is that we really are focusing on how are we creating an inclusive environment on the board, and really inviting diverse perspectives. And by focusing on that, and we assume by focusing on equity and inclusion that diversity will follow. And it's kind of the formula that we're working under.
And I'm curious, do you encounter like a perception that running kind of, and I know, Lisa, that OIA is OIA considered a nonprofit? I should say that's not,
We're not a 501c3. Our foundation is, but I guess we're considered, a trade association is a form of nonprofit.
Okay, so I know you ran, with National Park Foundation, Outdoor Foundation. So I'm just curious, do you find as strong women leaders a perception that running a nonprofit, especially with that kind of outdoor frame, is more like a feel-good hobby than a career, even though the demands are just as intense, if not more? This is some feedback I got in talking to folks about women running nonprofits.
Well, I got to tell you, that's a really offensive statement. It just is. The idea that why would you, I don't know, I think you just heard from the three of us, none of us come from a particularly privileged background. Why would we be doing a feel-good hobby for our careers? I'm not saying you believe this, Martin. I'm just saying,
that's what I want to ask about. Yeah, but I think sometimes there's this perception that I think folks look at nonprofit leadership in general as just softer than, for-profit business leadership. And I'm just wondering, as women, do you feel that that's a perception that is true? And just kind of your reaction to it. I agree, as someone who's spent my life obviously in nonprofit, it is offensive, but I run into that quite a bit myself. And so I'm just interested from women what your perspective is on that.
We'll say that I have seen and actually had on staff in previous roles, people that left the corporate sector thinking, I'm going to go make a difference in the nonprofit world. And, having a perception of what it was going to be. And I mean, I fired like 5 of them. It's like, who was your assistant? Because that person was getting shit done. You can't even tie your own shoes. I don't know what you're doing. So yeah, I mean, I think in general that perception is out there. And I would guess, I haven't seen these statistics, but even though the percentage of women, heads of nonprofit organizations is less than men, I'm guessing there's a higher percentage in the nonprofit sector than in the corporate sector.
There are, yes.
And I think that in part, that's probably because, those, at least, for people maybe in my generation, hopefully not so much for the next generation or two behind, that's what's available as far as leadership,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
One of the things that kind of excites me about the future is I think as we deal with all the disruption that's happening in the world, the line between for-profit and nonprofit is going to get closer together. I think 10 years ago, there was definitely this perception that nonprofits were ineffective, didn't know what they were doing, sat around and had no concept of business or strategy or anything like that, which wasn't true, but I think it was really the perception. And sometimes the perception in the nonprofit world was everybody in business was this money hungry, greedy, only focusing on the bottom line and everything else. And I do think that we are getting closer and closer to realizing they're simply different business structures, and they're going to be operating in similar ways and with similar levels of efficiency and similar. There's going to be some nonprofits that are ineffective and inefficient, and there's some businesses that are that. And there's going to be more awareness of how similar the ways in which those types of organizations operate.
I agree with you. And I actually think in some ways it's harder to run a nonprofit because you don't have as much control over some of the variables.
Yes.
So I think nonprofits didn't used to spend money on marketing, but business has understood for a long time that if you've got a great product, if nobody knows about it, nobody's going to buy it. And nonprofits, for some reason, boards were like, oh, don't put any money into marketing. Every dollar has to go into getting a kid out in a park, or whatever your purpose was. And there's just certain things that's just a lot harder to control, or you're dependent on quirky philanthropists who one year love you and then the next year they decide they like dogs better than children, and so I'm no longer going to give you that money, which has nothing to do with your product changing, because you're not going to go all of a sudden be about dogs.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think in some ways nonprofits are harder.
Yeah.
I know they are. I mean, a lot more variables. I think it's a good point.
I had someone, actually a former board member's friend of the Children Nature Network I was out with a week ago, and I said I was an outdoor consultant. They said, how do you make a life out of that? So I think there is some of that perception all around. So I'm interested, obviously you're all part of the network of LBC Action. I'm learning from all of you every day, but how can LBC Action, which is a male-led, is the principal organization, how can we do a better job of empowering and supporting women to move into these leadership roles as we talked about? Because we obviously want to be part of the solution, hopefully, and not part of the problem.
I think it's asking. And, if you're the head of an organization and you're male, and you need to go offer as much to your female employees as you do your male employees in terms of mentorship opportunities, being in the room. The most disturbing story, well, not the most, but one of the more disturbing stories I heard from a woman who is now at a very high level in state government and used to work for a nonprofit. It was largely male dominated, and she was left out of some decision making because a lot of the decisions were made when they went out drinking. And she was like, well, you can take me out for a beer. And they're like, no, we'll hit on you. So, it's you're left out of some conversations simply because you're a woman, and sometimes it's for really offensive reasons, like I just described, and sometimes it's just you're just not thought of.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Lisa. Courtney or Sarah, any thoughts?
I think that one of the things that you do so well, Martin, is connect people and to be a network. And, my ask would be that anytime you're thinking about doing that, to stop before you suggest a name or suggest a person to reach out to, and think, is there a woman, or is there somebody who didn't immediately spring to mind? That may not just be a woman, but who didn't spring to my mind immediately? And might there be somebody else that would actually be really great at that in a way I wasn't initially considering? Because it is those snap judgment situations and those, spur of the moment where our biases and our brains take over.
Thank you, Courtney. I appreciate that. Sarah?
I think, Martin, in some ways, I think in the role that you play, we've had this conversation over the last week, by being sort of behind the scenes and helping to elevate and amplify our work. But, I think that's a role you can continue to play, helping to navigate, tricky situations maybe where, at least in the case of the Children Nature Network, you have some relationships with, some of the men in the organization, and may be able to have conversations that are going to would be received, differently by me. Mm-hmm. And so I think those are ways that that you and your team can help and have been helping, frankly. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, but I really do hope that all three of you, and I know you will, but really, make sure that focus and that network is something that is empowering and supporting. Because my final question would be, I think all of you know that Amelie is a shining star in my life, and someone that I, really aspire to just make sure that I'm empowering her to be the strongest woman that she can be. So I'm just really curious if you could give Amelie, my daughter, one piece of advice as she grows into being kind of a professional woman. I know she aspires to be what all three of you are. I don't think she's met you, Lisa, but in Sarah and Courtney's case, you are definitely mentors to her. I'm just curious if you could give her a piece of advice as she's 11 years old now, that I could kind of give to her. What would it be?
Listen to Mandy.
Well,
sorry. I'm teasing.
I don't think so. That's not gender specific. I think everyone kind of has that perception. Lisa.
Like, write yourself a letter that you can read every year as you're a teenager to remind yourself how awesome you were at 11.
It's really good advice.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that. When you're 11, you're still a badass. You're still a boss.
She is.
And don't let anybody try to push you away from that.
Mhm.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I will just say, I believe in a community. Go ahead, Courtney.
One last comment, and this, I was a little torn about if I was going to say this or not, and because I really appreciate the spirit of which you just asked that question,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if you would have asked that question of men. Yeah.
They can give me no. I'm really interested in that. Like asking of men in what way, for Amelie or just interesting.
Like, would you have asked a panel of men advice on child rearing?
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I would have done that. See, that's where I think, we're always learning and growing, but it's also interesting for me because I think about how much Amelie, I think one of the reasons I ask is and maybe it's kind of interesting, and it kind of goes back to where we started when the three of you said that, like, you didn't necessarily have role models and you didn't really necessarily have, and it's interesting for me because, I mean, I meant what I said. Like, I think Amelie is very proud that I work with so many strong women, and she has very strong role models. I mean, when RBG passed away, it was a night of just real angst in our household. And so it's been interesting for me because I would say when I see, as excited as my wife Mandy gets with Joe Biden being president, Amelie's really like, well, he's just keeping the seat warm for Vice President Harris. So she really aspires, I think, around strong women leadership. And it's interesting when I think of who she's kind of highlighted to me as folks she aspires to be, she's never mentioned a man.
Yeah. Well, and I don't
from a generational standpoint. Yeah.
I think she is still of a generation that isn't given all equal opportunity, or the perception still hasn't been completely changed about what a woman is capable of. So I understand the idea of, giving advice to a young person to inspire them as they're growing up in, in a role that, with messages from society that aren't necessarily empowering. So I get that. But I also, I think it is interesting, the things that we don't even think about as to, it's almost like your question earlier of like, is that a hobby?
Yeah.
To me, there's a parallel, and I'm not drawing it very clearly right now, but.
No, I mean, I appreciate it. I think these are some of the difficult discussions. And I would even say this, I mean, as we're having this discussion, when I talk to some folks about having this discussion, there were a lot of men who I could tell were very uncomfortable. Did not think this was the smartest thing for a man to do. Yeah. Oh, hey, come on in. Oh, look who joined me.
Hey, Emily.
Hi there.
Hi, Emily.
So these are the strong women CEOs of LBC Action. So do you have anything that you wanted to say to them besides that I'm taking away from your chat room potentially with some of your friends?
No, she actually ended it early.
Okay.
Just make sure that you're the boss of him.
Oh, we are.
Also, you need to get a small hair towel head.
I have one right here.
And put it up.
Okay.
Put it up for you.
All right. Okay. So I guess probably, is there anything else before, you can come back on, anything before we wrap up that you'd like to kind of add? I'm so appreciative of the time. I'm so appreciative of all of you, your friends first in the community that you've helped kind of build, but any kind of last things before we wrap up on a Friday, because you guys have been so awesome with giving your time. I said guys again, it's the third time I've said guys, which is not good as a man. I'm working on
Martin,
it.
thank you for being vulnerable enough to do this.
Yes. Yes.
One more thing.
Okay, Amelie.
Convince him to get me a corgi.
Okay. Okay.
A what?
A corgi.
A corgi dog?
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
get her a corgi dog.
Yes.
I've been telling you that, Martin, for like a
I
year.
know. I know. Amelie will use any single opportunity
Smart girl.
lobby
Smart
for
girl.
You got to know where your pressure points are. That's
Yeah.
right.
So I have one question before we wrap up real quick. We just came to this interesting point, and I was telling them that I feel like all of your kind of heroes or role models, I feel like pretty much are women. Is that true, or am I making a characteristic?
Yeah.
They are. Okay. Do you have a favorite kind of person you look up to or a role model?
Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris. All right. And corgis. Nice.
I need corgis my role model.
Hey, listen, thanks to all of you. I really do respect and love all of you. So thank you for taking time on a Friday to do this. I'll make sure that I send over kind of the transcript, and we'll talk about next steps and what we do this. But really, I'm learning from all three of you every day. I really appreciate it.
Thank
See
you.
ya. Nice to see you,
guys.
Lisa and Courtney.
I
Nice to
shouldn't
see
say
you.
guys.
Really fun to
Nice
have a
to see all of you.
conversation.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Cheers.